In this video, we will show you how to replace your front steering knuckle on this Honda Accord. This is part of your front suspension located inside of your front wheel well. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. The first thing we need to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. Once you've done that, you can remove all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Remove your 32mm axle nut. If you're using a ratchet, you might find that this will want to spin on you. If that's the case, you could have a second person holding on the brake, which will prevent it from spinning, or just use a long pry bar coming across the studs down towards the ground. Use a hammer and punch. Come right inside the center of the axle. Just give that a couple taps to break it free from the wheel bearing. Along the backside of the knuckle is where you're going to find where your outer tie rod end connects. Remove your locking cotter pin and then remove the nut. On our application, I'll be using a 16mm to remove the nut. We'll give it a close inspection, make sure that that is still reusable. Continue on to breaking the outer tie rod end free from the steering knuckle. We can do this with either using a separator of some sort or just use a hammer and give this a couple taps. The vibration will cause this to break free. Before you do so, we'll take that nut and start it on just a couple threads. Inspect your tie rod end. Make sure you didn't cause any damage to the boot. We'll set this aside. Let's start removing the ABS sensor from the steering knuckle. You'll find if you were to follow that wire all the way down to the knuckle, there's a small 10mm headed bolt. Remove the bolt and then the sensor from the steering knuckle. Inspect your ABS sensor. If it's cracked or damaged in any way, you need to replace it. Ours looks fine. Let's continue following that ABS wire up to its mounting bracket on the steering knuckle. Take the ABS wire and set it aside, so you're sure it will not get damaged throughout the rest of this process. On the front of the steering knuckle, you'll find the flex hose. That flex hose is held in place to the steering knuckle with 2 10mm headed bolts. Remove the pair. Leave this one in just a couple threads. Hold on to that hose. We can remove that final bolt. Now we should have plenty of slack in this area. Let's move along the back side of the knuckle here to where the caliper mounting point is. To remove these 2 bolts, we'll be using a 17mm. Now once you have the top one out, just give it a quick inspection and start it back in a couple threads. Fully remove the lower bolt. We'll set that aside. Take hold of your caliper, remove that final bolt. Now we'll remove the caliper from the brake rotor. Slide the caliper off of there. We'll give the brake pads a quick inspection, make sure they are still in good condition. These could use replacement sometime soon, but we'll hang this aside, making sure we're putting no pressure on the flex hose. Now it's time to remove the brake rotor from the wheel bearing hub. To do that, you'll find that you have 2 Phillips head screws holding the rotor directly to that hub. While we're removing that, it's a good idea to have a lug nut in place, so once this does break free, it can't fall off and potentially hurt you. To remove those Phillips head screws, we'll be using a bit driver. Right up on here. Twist this counterclockwise, and we'll give it a couple loving bonks to break it free. Hold onto the rotor and remove that lug nut. After you've done so, you can remove your brake rotor and give it a quick inspection. We'll set this aside. Now we can start separating the lower ball joint from the steering knuckle. You'll find that you have a locking cotter pin and then a 17mm nut. Let's get these out of here. We'll use a hammer and pickle fork to separate the joint. Leave this in place and make your way to the upper ball joint. To start removing the upper ball joint from the steering knuckle, we have our locking cotter pin, and then we'll remove the nut. Just cut this right out of here. We'll use a 17mm for this. We'll just leave that on a couple threads. Continue on with a hammer. We're going to cause some vibration along the knuckle, being extremely careful not to damage the boot or the joint on the upper ball joint. Take hold of the upper control arm in your steering knuckle. You should find that you can compress the two together. We'll remove this mounting nut. Now we can separate this joint. As we do so, we're going to be pulling it outward, away from the vehicle. Pay attention to your axle shaft coming through the wheel bearing. As you pull it down, you need to be pushing this through the wheel bearing so you don't damage your axle. Reach along the inside here, take hold of that, give it a little wiggle. Now we can remove the lower ball joint nut. Make our way under here. Lift up on the knuckle as you continue. And we can slide this out of place. There it is, friend. With the knuckle completely out of the vehicle, before we get ready for installation, it's important to make sure you clean and inspect the splined and threaded area of your axle. Once you've done that, move along to the lower control arm. You want to inspect the port where that ball joint will go in. Both of these look fine on our application, so we can get ready for installation. We'll apply some copper anti-seize to the threaded area, and now we can install that knuckle. As we bring the lower ball joint into the lower control arm, you also want to be aligning the axle with the inside of that wheel bearing. Be careful not to damage the boot. Slide it into place and align your upper ball joint with the upper portion of the knuckle. Let's swing that control arm down so the ball joint's in the proper position and start on the mounting nut. Bottom out that nut and torque it to 35 foot-pounds. The next thing you want to pay attention to is the slots on the mounting nut in comparison to the hole that goes through the stud of the ball joint. If it's not lined up properly, continue tightening this nut until the very next slot is properly aligned. Put that cotter pin through and peen it over so there's no way this nut can loosen up on you while you're driving down the road. Move along to the lower ball joint. We'll start that on, bottom it out, and torque it to 65 foot-pounds. Now we'll be paying attention to the lower ball joint nut, aligning the slot of the nut with the hole that goes through the stud. There we are. Use some copper anti-seize on your wheel hub mating surface. The next thing you'll want to do is look along the back side of your brake rotor. You need to clean the mating surface that will go directly up against that brand new wheel hub. Use some sandpaper or a light disc and just go ahead and remove any of the debris on this area. Turn over the rotor and clean the front surface as well. Install your brake rotor, making sure that the studs align with their holes, but also the mounting screw holes align as well. We'll continue on with those 2 Phillips head screws. You want to make sure you start each of these in by hand. We'll start both of them in before we tighten either of them. Let's start reinstalling the caliper. Slide it into place over the brake rotor. Align your 2 mounting bolt holes and start in those mounting bolts. After you've done so, you can be using a 17mm. We'll bottom out each of these bolts. Torque each of these to 80 foot-pounds. Resecure your flex hose with those 2 10mm headed bolts. Start them in, bottom it out. Torque those to 7.2 foot-pounds. Now let's move along the back side of the knuckle. We'll reinstall that ABS sensor. Slide it into place in the knuckle, starting your 10mm headed bolt. Snug it up, torque it to 7.2 foot-pounds. Let's follow the ABS wire up to where the bracket connects onto the steering knuckle. Start in that mounting bolt, snug it up, and torque it to 7.2 foot-pounds as well. Confirm your bracket is secured and the ABS wire is not going to get damaged while you're driving down the road. Now it's time to re-secure our outer tie rod end to the steering knuckle. Slide that into position, start on the nut, snug it up, and torque it to 32 foot-pounds. Align the slot of the nut with the hole through the stud and put in that locking cotter pin. Get that cotter pin in here. Now it's time for the axle nut. We'll put this on here and bottom it out by hand. You never want to use an impact tool because you could cause damage to your bearing. Once you have it bottomed out, it's time to torque it to 134 foot-pounds. What you'll find is I use a pry bar coming across the studs, being very careful not to damage the threading, but I bring it diagonally down to the ground. That will prevent this from spinning on me while I continue torquing it. Once you have it torqued, it's important to pay attention to the small slot in the end of the axle. We'll use a hammer and punch and peen the nut down into that groove. That will lock it into place. Perfect. Confirm everything is nice and tight inside of the wheel well. Once you've done that, we'll continue on by reinstalling the wheel. Start on each of your 19mm lug nuts. We'll bottom them out, get the wheel back on the ground, and torque each one of these lug nuts to 80 foot-pounds. With the wheel safely on the ground, torque these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Okay friends, we showed you how to install the steering knuckle in your vehicle. At this point, you want to hop in the passenger compartment, pump up the brake pedal till it's nice and firm. Take your vehicle for a road test, listen for funny noises, and get yourself safely down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.